Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the monthly chart of silver provided by netdania.com. You can click on the link below. And we're watching this very closely here because you can see from the MACD that this is the most oversold we've ever been in the last nearly 20 years. So a tremendous bear market from that $50 price down to about $20. We're reset fully on the MACD. Could it go lower? Yes, it could. Do I think it's going to go lower? No, not likely. And if it does, I believe it will probably take a violent bounce and then spike back up. Maybe a very good buying opportunity for stackers who are looking to add to their stack. Now, let's take a look at how ridiculous these numbers are. This is the latest USGS mineral industry survey, and as someone pointed out, Silveraceous pointed out, that MineWeb has put out the latest figures on that, mentioning how silver has declined in the latest quarter. You can see here the totals for silver. This is U.S. production of selected mineral commodities by quarter. You can see silver here in metric tons, and then there's the quarterly breakdown. So the fourth quarter of 2012 there was 281 and then 261 this year. So for the total for the year, you can see that for the year of 2013 the production decreased, not by much but by some. So we're talking about 1,000 metric tons, let's say, roughly. Now, metric tons are going to convert to ounces at about 35,000, and when we do all the math, and I went by a $20 price, then we're talking about $700 million worth of silver. Now, this comes to about 35 million ounces, so that's going to be less than the number of Silver Eagles purchased in the year. But still, when we look at the amount, the dollar figure, the numbers are so small it really doesn't matter how much of a factor we're off by. So I'm just going to use that $700 million figure, which is the dollar value at current silver prices of this yearly production. So just to put that in perspective here, here's some numbers on what Americans spend their money on. And you can see Americans spend almost as much money a year on pretzels as they do on silver, or the value of the silver mined in the U.S. in a year. You can see that St. Patrick's Day costs about $4.14 billion. They spend about twice as much on teeth whiteners. You can see that Valentine's Day comes in at more than twice as much, at $1.7 billion. Americans spend $4.2 billion on perfume, $11 billion on coffee, $1.4 billion on organic coffee, and $35 billion on gambling. So you can see the ridiculously small amount of money that Americans spend on silver. How underpriced is silver based on those figures? I can't even calculate it. Obviously, Americans are not interested in silver right now, but I think that when the price really starts to rise, that's going to change. But we can see that it's so skewed right now that silver is undervalued by a factor of at least 10, and probably a lot more. Now, I wanted to comment a little bit on this thing that's going on in Nevada, and I'm going to read a couple of sides to this. Now, this is the mainstream media. First of all, if you go and look for the coverage of this story in the mainstream media, it's fairly sparse. They're pretty much downplaying this. They're not giving it a lot of coverage, which is pretty amazing to me when you look at the fact that now there are militias that are actually converging on this town. We'll read a little bit of this story. Protesters are arriving from across the country to join in local rancher Cliven Bundy's fight against the feds. People are arriving from Utah, Texas, Arizona, and Montana. Some are armed militiamen who say they have come to protect the family, and protesters who are standing up to the federal government. The Bundy movement in Bunkerville, Nevada is preparing for possible violence. Bundy addressed supporters Friday, flanked by 3 armed bodyguards, as he delivered a message about the country's founding fathers. That kind of makes you wonder. 3 armed bodyguards, kind of starting to look a little bit like maybe this is staged. I don't know. That's just a sneaking suspicion, I'm starting to think. They wanted a government close to the people, he said. His son says they've seen armed snipers patrolling the protest area from a distance, and they've already had 2 run-ins with federal rangers. Bundy has allowed his cattle to graze on public land illegally for the past 20 years. Last Saturday, the Bureau of Land Management started rounding them up, and that's when people started protesting. Following 2 recent run-ins with the feds, volunteer militia have offered to protect Bundy. They see him as a hero. And it goes on. So that's the mainstream media view of it. And I wanted to read to you this statement. I don't know if this is true or not. I can't say for sure. But this is allegedly a statement from Bundy's daughter, Cherie Bundy. And this is what she said. I've had people ask me to explain my dad's stance on this BLM fight. Here it is in as simple terms as I can explain it. There's so much to it, but here it is in a nutshell. My great-grandpa bought the rights to the Bunkerville allotment back in 1887, around there. Then he sold them to my grandpa, who then turned them over to my dad in 1972. These men bought and paid for their rights to the range and also built waters, fences, roads to assure the survival of their cattle, all with their own money, not with tax dollars. These rights to the land use are called preemptive rights. Somewhere down the line, to keep cows from overgrazing, came the Bureau of Land Management. They were supposed to assist the ranchers in the management of their ranges, while the ranchers paid a yearly allotment which was to be used to pay BLM wages and to help with repairs and improvements of the ranches. What's that saying? Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. My dad did pay his grazing fees for years to the BLM until they were no longer using his fees to help him to improve. Instead, they began using these monies against the ranchers. They bought all the rest of the ranches in the area out with their own grazing fees. When they offered to buy my dad out for a, she says a penance, I think she meant a pittance, he said no thanks and then fired them because they weren't doing their job. He quit paying the BLM but tried giving his grazing fees to the county, which they turned down. So my dad just went on running his ranch and making his own improvements with his own equipment and his own money, not taxes. In essence, the BLM was managing my dad out of business. Well, when buying him out didn't work, they used the endangered species card. You've already heard about the desert tortoise. Well, that didn't work either, so they began the threats and the court orders, which my dad has proven to be unlawful for all these years. Now they're desperate. It's come down to buying the brand inspector off and threatening the county sheriff. Everything they're doing at this point is illegal and totally against the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, you may be saying, how sad, but what does this have to do with me? Well, I'll tell you. They will get rid of Cliven Bundy, the last man standing on the Bunkerville allotment, and then they will close all the roads so that no one can ever go on it again. Next, it's Utah's turn. Mark my words, Utah is next. Then there's the issue of the cattle. They're at this moment being stolen. See, even if Dad hasn't paid them, those cattle do belong to him. Regardless where they are my father's property. His herd has been part of that range for over 100 years, long before the BLM even existed. Now the feds think they can just come in and remove them and sell them without a legal brand inspection or without my dad's signature on it. They think they can take over 2 borders, which is illegal. Ask any trucker. Then they plan to take them to the Richfield auction and sell them, all with our tax money. They have paid off the contract cowboys and the auction owner as well as the Nevada brand inspector with our tax dollars. See how slick they are? Well, that's a nutshell. So that supposedly is his daughter's statement. 2 very large discrepancies in the facts. I don't know the facts one way or the other. I will say, though, that from looking at the history of the U.S. government, I would say that this is consistent. What she describes is consistent with their pattern in the past. And just to give you an example of that, this is a story that we posted to the blog yesterday, and this is about the Diego Garcia military base. Now, you'll remember that this military base became a topic of conversation of late because of the story of that missing flight and speculation that it ended up at this military base. So people started paying attention to it, and I came across some stories that had been written about it. Now this is about the forced relocation of the islanders. They're called the Chagosians, and I don't have time to go into all the history here. I've put it in the article, including some information from Wikipedia, but you'll have to go and research it yourself. Basically, they were the descendants of slaves who had been put on that island to farm, and then over the years they had pretty much become the inhabitants of that, and the U.S. Navy decided they wanted to build a base there, and they kicked them out. So let's read a little bit of this. This is not really disputed history as far as I can tell. This is pretty much admitted, and this is apparently what happened. In order to convert the sleepy Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia into a dominating military base, the U.S. forcibly transported its 2,000 Chagosian inhabitants into exile and gassed their dogs. By banning journalists from the area, the U.S. Navy was able to perpetuate this with virtually no press coverage, says David Vine, an assistant professor of anthropology at American University and author of Island of Shame, The Secret History of the U.S. Military on Diego Garcia, Princeton University Press. The Chagosians were put on a boat and taken to Mauritius and the Seychelles, 1,200 miles away, where they were left on the docks with no money and no housing to fend for themselves, Vine said in an interview show, Books of Our Time, sponsored by the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Quote, they were promised jobs that never materialized. They had been living on an island with schools, hospitals, full employment, sort of like a French coastal village, and they were consigned to a life of abject poverty in exile, unemployment, health problems, and were the poorest of the poor, Vine told interview host Lance Favell, dean of the law school. Their pet dogs were rounded up and gassed, and their bodies burned before the very eyes of the traumatized owner, Vine said. They were moved because they were few in number and not white, Vine added. The U.S. government circulated the fiction that Chagosians were transient contract workers that had taken up residence only recently, but in fact they had been living on Diego Garcia since about the time of the American Revolution. Merchants had imported them to work on the coconut and copra plantations, Vine said. U.S. government induced the Washington Post not to break a story spelling out the events on the island. So I'll let you read the rest of that. It's a shocking story. There's a story from the Mirror. There is an article from Wikipedia that I've linked here, and all seems to add up to nefarious deeds by the U.S. government. This is a review that I posted here from a reader of the book Island of Shame, and I'll read this review. A very well-researched account of a most disgraceful episode involving the adverse treatment of the Chagossian people by the UK and US governments. It reveals how and why the UK and US governments colluded with each other to remove the Chagossians from the Chagos archipelago to allow a secret military base to be built at Diego Garcia. This book is of particular interest to me because the removal of the Chagossians from their island between 1968 and 1973 occurred during my secondary school years in the Seychelles Islands. I must deduce that at that time the removal of the Chagossians was done in a most secretive manner, for I do not recall any discussion, conversation, or debate, radio program, there was no TV, political debate, public rally, public comment by the then Seychelles Governor Sir Bruce Greatbatch on the issue, nor do I recall the Catholic Church ever once mentioning this issue in any Sunday Mass or at any other time. My parents, of course, did mention Diego Garcia from time to time, but I can only presume they were kept in the dark because they never mentioned anything about the plight of the Chagossians. The Chagossians were considered the cousins of the Seychelles with an almost identical Creole language and heritage. As I read this book, I cannot explain the anger I felt and feel for this gross injustice carried out by Britain and America against the innocent Chagossians. It is tantamount to a crime against humanity. This book exposes the gross hypocrisy of the British and the Americans. They were preaching human rights to the world while abusing the human rights of the Chagossians, and all because the U.S. needed Diego Garcia for a military base. I wish everyone would read this book in this day and age. It leaves one wondering how on earth the UK and the U.S. could be so cruel to such an innocent, defenseless people who were living peacefully in their idyllic paradise, only to be forcibly removed from their islands and abandoned in the slums of Mauritius and Seychelles without any resettlement plans or compensation. So there's the article. I encourage you to read it. Now, what's very interesting to me is the banning of journalists. Now, back to the story here, we're living in a different time, and we're living in a time now of citizen journalists where it's not so easy for the government to muzzle the press. Certainly it is for the mainstream press, so we've already seen the little coverage here. But the alternative media is growing stronger by the day, and they are covering these sorts of things. So it's going to be very interesting to watch this thing play out. My guess at this point, I think that the government is going to back down. It looks like now, with a lot of people arriving, that and politicians as well pledging to go there, that it may be that the feds have overplayed their hand, and hopefully we're in a different day now where they can't get away with the types of horrific crimes that they perpetrate against people, removing them from their land. Hopefully we're going to be in a different time where they have to back down. And we'll talk to you next time.